For the year 2022, I want to go through the book of Matthew. It's probably going to take me the year 2023 as well to go through Matthew. It's a big book, but got to start somewhere. So I want to go through the book of Matthew, and Matthew chapter 1 starts with Matthew's version of the Christmas story. But Matthew's version of the Christmas story, it's got some really dark and challenging stuff in it that I didn't think was appropriate for Christmas. But as we start going through the new year, I think it's a good time to go through some challenging stuff. So here we go. Matthew chapter 1 starts with this long list of names. Now this long list of names is the family tree of a man named Joseph. The whole point is to show us that Joseph's family tree would end up becoming Jesus' family tree. Now this family tree, this long list of names, it is spanning hundreds of years, many generations, and behind each name is a story about very imperfect people. And this list, this family tree of imperfect people, is the family that Jesus came from. Jesus came from a family of imperfect people, which means we can come into God's family as an imperfect person. This reminds me of the amazing Nikki Schumacher. Nikki makes amazing videos about family, lifestyle, and homemaking. She's a huge inspiration. And the tagline for Nikki's videos is, I am perfectly imperfect in every way. So God bless you, Nikki. I am perfectly imperfect in every way. Jesus came from a family of imperfect people, which means we can come into God's family as an imperfect person. So this family tree leads to a man named Joseph, and we meet Joseph in a very difficult time, perhaps the most difficult time in his life. Joseph is pledged to marry a woman named Mary. Mary's pledged to marry Joseph. And then Joseph discovers that the woman he's meant to marry is suddenly pregnant with somebody else's child. And her explanation for being pregnant with somebody else's child is that an angel of the Lord came to her and told her that she has been chosen to carry God's one and only child, the Messiah. That would have been her explanation to her husband about why she was pregnant with somebody else's child. Now obviously with 2,000 years of hindsight, we know that Mary was telling the truth. But imagine you're Joseph. Imagine you're a young man about to be married, and you find out that your soon-to-be wife is pregnant with somebody else's child. And that's the explanation you hear. If you're Joseph and if you're honest, it's a very hard story to believe. Now here's something important to understand. The family tree at the start of Matthew chapter 1 shows us that Joseph was a descendant of King David. He was from David's bloodline. And from Joseph's earliest childhood memories, he would have known that he was a descendant of King David. Among the first things he would have known was that he was from David's bloodline. And among the first things Joseph would have learned was that David was a man after God's heart. Joseph would have grown up knowing David's story. And from childhood and growing into manhood, Joseph would have endeavored to be a man after God's heart, just like the man he descended from was, a man after God's heart. So when it came time for Joseph to be married, he would have looked for a woman who was a woman after God's heart. He and his family wouldn't have settled for anything less. So Joseph would have chosen Mary because he was convinced that she was a woman after God's heart. Luke's gospel shows us Mary's experience of this story. And in Luke's gospel we see that Mary is someone who loves God with all her heart. Look at her interaction with the angel Gabriel. Look at the poem, look at the song she sings. Look at her whole attitude in Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel makes it clear that Mary is a woman after God's heart. She is someone who loves God with all her heart. And the picture we see of Mary in Luke's gospel, this is how her community would have seen her. This is how Joseph would have seen her. So Joseph would have been convinced that Mary was a woman after God's heart. So imagine how Joseph feels when he finds out that the woman he's going to marry, a woman he believed was a woman after God's heart, she is suddenly pregnant with another man's child. It would have been shocking. It would have made no sense. How can a woman who loves God with all her heart, how can a woman after God's heart be pledged to marry a man and then suddenly become pregnant with another man's child? It was shocking. It made no sense. Now here's something else we have to understand. A Jewish marriage had 3 stages. The third stage was the wedding itself. 7 days of celebration followed by the bride and groom leaving the household of their father and mother and spending their first night together and then spending a lifetime together. That was the third stage of marriage. Joseph and Mary were only at the second stage of marriage, the betrothal. Joseph was pledged to marry Mary. Mary was pledged to marry Joseph. Joseph had paid the dowry, part of it if not all of it. but he was financially invested in the marriage. And Mary, he was definitely emotionally invested in the marriage. I'm sure Mary was emotionally invested. She's looking forward to marrying a man who is a man after God's heart. He's looking forward to marrying a woman who is a woman after God's heart. And then but then there's a surprise. At the second stage of marriage, they were legally married, but they hadn't slept together yet. For lack of a better term, they hadn't slept together yet. That only happened at the third and final stage of marriage. After 7 days of celebration, the bride and groom leave the household of their father and mother, and they spend their first night together, and then spend a lifetime together. Until then, there was no sleeping together. You were only meant to sleep together at the third and final stage of marriage. So if it became known that Mary was pregnant when she and Joseph were only at the second stage of marriage, it wouldn't have looked good. And it would have gotten so much worse. And since weddings are very public, people would have known that Joseph and Mary were only at the second stage of marriage. So when it was discovered that Mary was pregnant and she and Joseph were only at the second stage of marriage, it wouldn't have looked good. And it would have gotten so much worse if it was discovered that Mary was pregnant and Joseph wasn't the father. See, since Mary's pledged to marry Joseph and then she becomes pregnant with somebody else's child, in the eyes of the world, it would have looked like Mary had committed adultery. And the law at the time for committing adultery was severe. The law was if you committed adultery, you were stoned to death. It's in the book of Deuteronomy. God's laws can seem so severe. It can be hard to understand God's perspective, especially in the Old Testament. It can be hard to understand God's perspective, but it is important to understand that God sees the big picture. Even people who've never touched the Bible, they know that sexual unfaithfulness can destroy relationships, destroy families, destroy communities. So God sees the big picture. He sees what destroys people's lives, and he puts severe laws in place, preventative measures to protect people from their lives being destroyed. It's not to harm, it's to protect people from their lives being destroyed. The point is, there was a serious possibility that Mary could have been stoned to death. There's nothing particularly Christmassy about a young mother being stoned with her unborn child, but that's a part of the Christmas story. I don't think kids need to hear that until much later. But here's something else that's really important to understand. Scripture makes it clear that Joseph didn't believe Mary's story, based on his decision to divorce her quietly. It is likely that Joseph would have found Mary's story impossible to believe. But it would have been impossible for Joseph to believe that Mary was lying. She would not have come across as someone making up a story. Far from it. She would have had complete mental, emotional, and spiritual conviction in what she was saying. So if it was impossible for Joseph to believe Mary's story, but it was also impossible for Joseph to believe that Mary was lying. The other possibilities for how Mary became pregnant were quite scary. It was not out of the realm of possibility for a Roman soldier to be attracted to a young Jewish woman. Romans were known to use their power for evil, and so it was not out of the realm of possibility for a Roman soldier to pursue his attraction to a young Jewish woman by doing something evil. It's possible that something like this was going through Joseph's mind. I wonder what was going through Joseph's mind. To explore what may have been going through Joseph's mind, I read a scene like a scene from a play. So here we are. Lord, I don't know what to do. How can anyone believe that story? I don't know why she believes that story. I don't know how she became pregnant. She loves you, Lord. She would never. Did something happen to her, Lord? Did someone harm her? Is that how? Make me lie down in green pastures. Lead me beside the still waters. Lord, could her story be true? The Messiah. I am a descendant of King David. The Messiah will be a descendant of King David. Have you brought the Messiah into my family? Have you chosen Mary and I to look after your child? Lord, I don't know what to do. I'll divorce her quietly. I won't let any harm come to her. So Joseph decides to divorce Mary quietly. And the reason is, he didn't want to expose Mary to public disgrace. He didn't want Mary to experience disgrace. Joseph reveals he has a heart that desires grace. By making this decision, Joseph reveals he has a heart that desires grace. He has a heart that resembles God's heart. By making this decision, Joseph reveals that he is a man after God's heart, just like King David, the man he descended from. It's funny, when Joseph first discovers that Mary is pregnant, he would have been heartbroken. But then when he finds out that she has been chosen by God to carry God's one and only child, Joseph would have recognized that he too has been chosen. It becomes clear that Joseph is a part of God's plan. I find it really funny that Joseph's plan was to marry a woman who was a woman after God's heart. Joseph's plan was to get married. And this would become so much more than the story of a young man getting married. God had much bigger plans for Joseph. And I think that's God's sense of humor. Our plans are, this is our plans and this is God's plans. God has a massive sense of humor. God has a sense of humor. I also find it funny that Mary's pregnancy was initially so shocking. It made no sense. How can a woman who loves God with all her heart, how can a woman after God's heart be pledged to marry a man and then become pregnant with somebody else's child? It was shocking. It made no sense. But thank God, literally thank God, when the truth is revealed, she wasn't pregnant with another man's child. She was pregnant with God's child. So it makes perfect sense that a woman after God's heart, a woman who loves God with all her heart, it makes sense that she would be chosen to carry God's one and only child, the Messiah. I just find it funny how something that initially is so shocking and makes no sense ultimately makes perfect sense. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you again.